in order to begin processing purchase orders, you must first perform all of your setup functions. To access the purchase order setups, you would go to your purchase order module, and under your setup folder are all the initial setups that you need to define in order to begin using purchase orders. Under your purchase order options is where we're going to define all of those initial setups. Under our main tab, the first question that is asked is how many days do you want to retain a completed purchase order? MAS considers a completed purchase order a purchase order where the ordered quantity, received quantity, and invoice quantity are all the same. So if I order 10 and receive 10 and invoice 10, the system will then purge this completed purchase order during standard period end processing. In my setup, I'm retaining them for 0 days, so as soon as that purchase order is considered completed, the month that it's completed in, period end, will then purge that order. You have the option of actually saving this for 999 days, but I'm going to leave my settings at 0. You also have an option to automatically close a partially received purchase order. So in an example of only ordering 10 items, maybe you order 10, but only 9 are received. You could have this setting turned on where you could say that maybe if my receipt variance is only 10%, I'm going to automatically close that. So if I happen to receive 9 of the 10, it will then automatically close that purchase order so it can no longer be received upon. Your next setup question is, do you want to post your accounts payable invoices? What this will allow you to do is use the purchase order receipt of invoice entry, and it'll allow you to assign an invoice number to a receiving, and then it will automatically create that payables invoice in the accounts payable module. You also have to define your calendar month, which would be your calendar year and current period. This would ultimately increment when you do your period end close, and it will change. In our example, it would, once we close out May of 2010, it will then increment to June of 2010. You should always use the period end processing function to increment these settings. The system also needs to find out what other modules within MAS you're going to be integrating with. So do you need to integrate with General Ledger as far as posting your transactions to General Ledger? Are you also going to need to be integrated with inventory? So are you going to be accessing inventory items from the inventory management module on your purchase orders? You also additionally have the option for job cost, bank rec, and work order. And this integration is all dependent on what modules your company currently has installed. Over on the additional tab, we have the question of, do we want to post our registers to General Ledger in detail? So what this will allow me to do is all of my individual transactions on a purchase order, if I receive 10 different items, I will get each of those independently posted to General Ledger in detail. If I do not turn on this option, all of my postings in any given entry will just be a lump total to those specific General Ledger accounts. You also have a few options in regards to what kind of comments you want appearing in General Ledger. So when you process receipts and returns, you have a few different options for your comments. You could have a vendor name and reference number, or maybe the vendor name's not important to you, but the vendor number is. This setup, once defined, will then allow any future postings to post those specific comments to General Ledger. The same goes for your material requisition comments. You have a few different options on what you want to appear in your General Ledger postings. And again, if you change this at any given time, it will then post those types of comments for all future transactions. You also need to define specific General Ledger accounts for a few other items. If you are going to be using material requisition, the system needs to know what is that expense account supposed to be when you actually perform a material requisition. Same thing with your special item cost. If you're not using inventory items or you're not using miscellaneous items, you can use the asterisk type items. And when you do that, you do have to require one GL account number for where the cost will get associated to. Same goes for a payables deposit on your purchase order, as well as prepaid freight expense. Under the Entry tab, you have the option to do batch processing. You can perform batch processing in receipt entry, return entry, as well as material requisition entry. Enabling your batch processing is really a good idea to do if you have multiple people performing those transactions. That way, individuals can have a batch open and perform their own set of receipt of goods entries, and then the second person can have their own batch open doing receipt of good entries. The benefit to this is that the first person can then access just their transactions, and they can also update just their transactions. The second person's entries would not be affected. Not turning on batch processing would have both users populating data into one entry and basically processing one update. So again, if you have multiple users doing receipt of goods entries, return of good entries, receipt of invoice entries, you may want to enable batch processing to keep the individual's entries separate. Also in your setups here is where you defined all of your order numbers. So what is my next purchase order number to be, my next receipt of goods number, and so forth. These can be overridden at data entry, but when you hit your next purchase order number or your next receipt of goods number while you're performing data entry, this is where the system is looking at to define what is the next number supposed to be. You also have an option of setting a default warehouse for your purchase orders. So when you enter a purchase order, your default in this setup would be 000. This can be overridden at the time of entry, as well as a default bank code. If you do need to override it at time of entry, you most certainly can at that time. You also have an option to allow the entry of sales tax and freight without an invoice. So if you did want to perform that function, you would need to turn that feature on. You also have an option to apply discounts to sales tax and freight. This would come into play when you're doing quantity breaks. Maybe you have a vendor, if you order 1 to 50 of an item, you get a specific discount. The question then comes, do you also want that discount to apply to your sales tax and freight associated with that order? Over on our Lines tab, you do have the option of entry of landed cost. With entry of landed cost, at the time of your receipt of goods, you can define an additional expense, such as maybe a duty fee or an additional freight fee. Landed cost can then be separated against the items as far as dispersed based on weight, based on volume. You have those few different options. But again, landed cost can only be entered at the time of receipt of goods. If you're not going to use landed cost, you still can allocate freight on a line item basis. Freight would just be the freight entry on the purchase order. Landed cost, again, gives you multiple options where you can create different levels of landed cost. But if you have just freight, you do have the option to do it based on the cost per item, quantity per item, the weight of the item, or the volume. Now, all of these options obviously would need to be populated on those inventory items to understand how much the weight and volume were if you did choose those features. You also have the option to include your allocated cost and your default unit cost. You can also allow the quantity received or invoiced to exceed the quantity ordered. So if maybe I only ordered 10, but the vendor actually shipped me 11, are we going to allow the receipt of that 11, or are we only going to limit the receiver to only accept 10? You also have an option regarding your dropship orders. Do you want to include all dropship line items? So for example, if you have an inventory item that is set to a primary vendor, your dropship items could be for only that primary vendor. Or do you prefer being asked the question, maybe those line items are not all for a single primary, but you want them all to come in on a purchase order. Now your dropships are actually only available if you are using dropship orders. Over on the printing tab, you have a few different options based on how you want to print your registers. Do you want to print additional usage information? Do you want to print your tax information? You also have an option to print return orders. So if you're actually going to do a PO return, this feature would need to be turned on in order to generate that form. You have additional options regarding the back order fill report. How would you like to sort that report? You can sort it by sales order, customer number, as well as bill to name. Do you only want to print items that are received? Or do you also only want to include all sales order lines? So again, these are all options based on your printing settings. Once these options have been changed, they will then appear for any of those future printings. Over on the History tab, the question becomes, how many years do you want to retain all of that purchase history? So even though you are purging potentially some completed purchase orders, you're still going to retain the purchase history of a vendor in regards to how often you have purchased a specific item from a vendor. So you can actually set your years up to 99. Do you also want to retain all of your receipt history? Do you want to retain comment lines in receipt history? So if you begin adding large comments to your receipts, those may become beneficial to retain in history along with the receipt history. Do you also want to purge the purchase order recap at period end? So that function is the purchase order recap report, and at period end processing, it will then purge that function. One final note in your purchase order options is in the lower right-hand corner of all of your windows inside of MAS, you'll notice you have your little help function. When you're setting up your options, utilize this help function to assist you in any one of the questionable fields. So for example, if I go into my About This window, you'll notice there's a few different links regarding how do I process deposits, how do I print a report listing. However, if you scroll down, you'll notice under the Fields section, every tab is outlined and every field then has detailed information. So example, under my Main tab, one of the questions of days to retain completed purchase orders, if you click on that option, you will see the standard write-up in regards to how that can be retained. So I highly recommend you use your help screens in order to assist you in any one of these individual fields in regards to your options setup.